Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner. Uh-oh. You there,
Dr. Bud Marr here.
There you go.
Ah.
There, that's good. Yeah, so we're The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, broadcasting from KWKY Studios, here, Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. Here on this Ash Wednesday, it's good to have you all listening. I am over here in Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences and the Executive Vice President for the Newman Idea. You can reach us at mchs.edu and newmanidea.org. But out there in Pittsburgh, what are you up to?
Bo, I'm directing the National Institute for Newman Studies here in Pittsburgh. You can find more about what we do here at newmanstudies.org. I have to say, though, if the show starts and I give my greetings and then I realize you can't hear me, it's kind of freaky for me.
You think you've just been fired, in a very cruel way?
Yeah, you probably didn't experience this because you just had the Bobby, the one brother. Mm-hmm. But when we were little, one prank we'd play on our little brother is pretend like we couldn't see him, and he would start freaking out. All the other siblings are like, "Where's Travis?" It's pretty fun to do to a 5-year-old.
That seems to work against how radio would work, but I suppose I could have an entire show where we're like, man, we really wish Bud. I hope wish he was commentating. You're like, Bo, I'm here. Yeah, that would not be compelling radio.
Screaming thoughts from Pittsburgh, and you guys have me muted the entire time.
The guest on the show is extremely confused. Yeah, I don't think we should do that, so we're not going to. Uh-oh, now I worry that but on our end, we always worry that we lose you completely. So I'll say this, The Uncommon Good brought to you always as by our underwriter, Mercy College of Health Sciences. Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu, where we have multiple times for you to start, multiple ways for you to get into the health field. We have certain degrees that are completely online. We have accelerated degrees, for instance, in nursing. We're in the midterms, getting close to midterms now. And so I know we had Fat Tuesday celebrations yesterday where we had Chris Cakes in, a wonderful group that does, pancakes and stuff like this. They have one of those express grills, and they're very yummy pancakes. So we got to see all sorts of students. And coterminous with that, on this week, they've been putting sloths out to try to get everybody to slow down and to make sure that the students take time to slow down and relax. We hope that you guys are not having, I don't know if Ash Wednesday's ever considered all that relaxing, but I hope it's a time to stop and contemplate. And that's, of course, we're going to talk have an Ash Wednesday themed show. But just so you know, next week, to remind you, on Tuesday, March 3rd at 6:30, we have our Faith and Healing Speaker Series. Charles Camosi, who's been on the show now twice. You can go back in our archives. If you go to theuncommongood.simplecast.fm, you can listen to any of our old shows that we have recorded. But Charles Camosi's taped off 2, and he's going to be talking about throwaway culture. So how are we going to reimagine politics as Catholics if we realize that both parties don't live up to what Pope Francis is calling the resistance to the culture of the throwaway culture. So again, you can see that, mchs.edu. We have that up when that is. But one more time, Tuesday, March 3rd at 6:30, and it's open to the public at Mercy College of Health Sciences in Sullivan Center, 130. But I know that Pittsburgh's a bit far away, but if you just happen to get lost a little bit, tell the kids you're going out to get a burrito. We'd love to have you down to talk to Charles in person.
Yeah, that might be a surprise to Rachel. I could see what I could do. We're having our spring symposium March 12th and 13th. So for those who listen in Pittsburgh from their audio cast at the Newman Institute here in Oakland, Dr. Tim O'Malley is going to be giving the keynote, and then Jenny Martin and Matthew Levering on the next day.
Everybody's just doing their spring cleaning, but for the dorks involved in academia, we have our spring talks, which is you clean out the mind and put in new ideas for it. Speaking of cleaning things up and, taking times to cleanse, that's exactly what we're starting. The first day of Lent over here in the West, 2020, Ash Wednesday. And I know that on the radio today, you're going to hear quite a bit, I'm sure, about Lenten practices, a reminder of those three great penances that the Church encourages us to do, fasting, almsgiving, and prayers, that we rededicate ourselves to these three practices. They're, of course, not negatives. They're penitential because we, put the intention in mind to change our ways and turn to once more to the Lord. But the idea is, what does this have to do with the common good? Is it true that an order and a society is different, that places penance centrally in what it does in a calendar time? Also, what it means to maybe be too penitential. This isn't something that the Church says you do all year. So, what does it do to? What's the Church trying to do when it comes to the mean between extremes, and understanding that it's not simply individuals that do penance, but we do this as a community and a society. So that's what we're up to today. I don't think Bud and I have, Lent recipes or anything like that, unless, Bud, have you been working on, like a lentil soup recipe? I know your wife has a good one.
No, in the Marr household, we're vegetarian a lot of the time, so that's not really too much of a hurdle for us. I am glad to hear at Mercy that you guys did the pancake tradition. Thinking back to my Protestant days, that's one thing that I really enjoyed, was like Fat Tuesday, having pancakes. I do like the name Shrove Tuesday because it brings up the idea of shriven, which maybe we can get into in the second half of the show. But I'm all for Catholic parishes like picking up that tradition.
I very much agree. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back talking about Ash Wednesday in the public order after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. This is Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, broadcasting from the KWKY Iowa Catholic Radio studios on Ash Wednesday. Wonderful to have you as a part of our listening audience. Thank you for listening. And just one more time to the general audience, thank you for everyone who donated to Iowa Catholic Radio in our Carathon last week. And I hope everybody who gets to hear us elsewhere makes the consideration of donating to their local Catholic radio stations as well. Just to keep throwing out, of course, that doesn't mean that being able to do something like Iowa Catholic Radio, we're set for the year. This is something, of course, that we have to always imitate St. Francis of Assisi and be beggars and ask for your help so that we can keep this apostolate rolling. And so when we're talking about Ash Wednesday and Lent, and we're talking about almsgiving, please consider among the other people that you are giving alms to that Iowa Catholic Radio could be one of those considerations that you prayerfully discern about giving alms and making the word of Christ possible through your donations to Iowa Catholic Radio and other Catholic radio stations. So, Bud, one of the things when you get to broadcast on Ash Wednesday, and I realize that on Wednesdays we kind of we end up hitting quite a few holy days, it seems, for different reasons. But Ash Wednesday certainly is always going to be one of them. And there's a way in which you can decide, we'll just have like a normal radio program and maybe sort of refer to the elephant in the room. But I think obviously when it's Ash Wednesday, it's so important for the life of the Church that it's good to always take a moment and an episode to talk about what we're doing here. And I know sometimes in the past, maybe we've just talked about Ash Wednesday itself or fasting or zeroed in on certain aspects of what Ash Wednesday and Lent is about. But I think one of the telling marks of Ash Wednesday and Lent and penance is the social character of doing this all together. It's one thing for us to consider, what am I individually going to give up each Lent? And I think it makes a lot of sense for that dialogue between you and the Lord to ask, what can I do best to turn towards you again, Lord? Should be considered. But it's also important to realize that we do this as a community. Ash Wednesday marks the communal beginning of all of these penances. You can do penances throughout the year, but this is a communal one, and it's important that we do it together. You see this done in different ways. Literally, you were pointing this out, Fat Tuesday sort of the big celebrations right before Lent is one way that we remind ourselves that we're in this time of penance together. Also, when you assign penances, it's good for you to try to figure out maybe something you think you should give up, but it's good to do this either in dialogue with a spiritual director. Bud and I are a group of friends where we actually randomly, each year, we assign each other books, so there's something that someone outside of our own will and decisions asks us to do, some spiritual reading. But then there's also, of course, communal penance services where people go and do confession together. If you can do meals that are in the spirit of Lent. These are all practical things to say, but this gets to the much deeper question of what does it mean to have a public order that believes penance is important enough to really make time itself stand still and to change what it is that we're expecting to do throughout our public life in a time of Lent. But that's the first question I think to throw out there is to say, does a public order that believes penance is central enough to make an entire season revolve around the idea of penance, does that make a common difference to those public orders that believe that and those that don't?
I think it really does. Maybe this is more of a struggle just on my own. I don't know how many of our listeners struggle with this sort of thing, but I think when it comes to penance for me, I can often construe it in very individualistic terms. So this is something I'm taking on, and it's between me and God. But I think if you look at this time of year, even in America today, you see, so one of our themes on the show, Bo, is really like, how is what we practice as Catholics, how does this reverberate to the common good? And Rachel and I are always, like this time of year as we drive through in the car, we're amazed at the number of establishments that still offer like fish specials during Lent in a time and age where, we all know like religious practice, if you tabulate it by church attendance, is down. And yet that's still kind of a hangover. And for me, it's a reminder of if we take these things seriously, how easily it can kind of create these ripple effects that we don't intend. But I think if Catholics can really live into this and lean into it, it could make a big difference. And what comes to mind for me is the whole idea of cancel culture, where these days on the internet, social media, if you end up making a faux pas, you can be quote unquote canceled, where you've said something that makes you kind of a moral leper and you're no longer allowed to speak to matters of public discourse. And certainly there are times where someone like crosses a line where there has to be repercussions. But what I see in our culture is that we have this tendency to like to see people have their comeuppance and to get what's coming to them. But there are no ways, or very few ways in our culture, to restore people. So, like a political figure like Bill Clinton makes this huge mistake, and we want to see him confess publicly. But I think our culture has evacuated the possibility for people to truly ask for forgiveness and to do penance, and so persons just get canceled. And the Catholic Church, of course, offers folks something much deeper and richer.
No, I like this idea that if we look at the paltry nature of a lot of public apologies, and you hear people think about this out loud, whether this is a sincere apology or not, and I think we've all been accustomed and maybe desensitized to the idea about what an actual sincere apology would sound like, because most apologies that are ever given in public obviously have the imprints of marketing and legal matters, the washing machine of those two concerns that they've gone through. And what you're getting at is not, isn't this so terrible? Why can't we, reform or have people who say horrible things get to say horrible things in the future? I get exactly what you're saying, that we need to get at the root of why have we set up the world where it's impossible to actually have genuine apologies and genuine penance. And partly, but I think it's what you're saying is because apologies so rarely in our modern consumerist age have the outlet of a penance, even if it's symbolic, that starts to be the issue is, well, you can apologize till you're blue in the face, but since there's no sort of public publicly held idea about how a public figure would go make penance. Even if someone chose to, walk barefoot in the snow, who would they walk to? Who would they kneel before? Who would they ask the penance of? What's considered a public enough square for this to happen? If you're a media figure who made a faux pas, do you have to go to Times Square and, bow before Ellen DeGeneres and ask if you're allowed to make tweets again? I mean, this is exactly the sort of lack that we have. I was even thinking in a humorous way that, during Lent, all of a sudden, when all the Catholics go off Twitter because they're doing a Lenten fast of social media, that's when all the people who got in trouble last year get another shot to see if they can behave. And if by Easter they can behave, they get to be back full time. Again, I love this idea that there's sort of like the grand wow, I'm blanking on this name. As I keep fumbling, I make it less and less funny. I'm the Grand Inquisitor of Twitter. That's what I was trying to get at. Like a Dostoevsky type character that gets to decide whether people have successfully canceled their own cancellation. It can all sound silly, but I think this gets to the root of things, Bud, is we're not even sure how to evaluate apologies because we're not quite sure how an apology can be vindicated. We want it to be, sincere. And since we don't have an idea about how you can apologize and then make up for it through penance, we kind of have this alchemy of, does it sound like they intended it and it's authentic enough? But of course, you could get to the point that if you could, survey the nation and find out what's required for people to think that an apology sounds authentic, don't you know that the marketing majors would figure that out and then they would just counsel their clients to make that apology? Because we don't have the outlet of incarnating apologies, we've sort of short-shrifted the capacity for that metanoia, that to turn around to show people that we're trying to make amends for what we've done. And so, sure, that might be cancel culture on social media, but I think it drives, Bud, exactly how you put it, at something much deeper wrong with our society.
Yeah, and pivoting from cancel culture a bit, we've had guests on the show who talked about, say, Will Kavanaugh regarding capital or consumerism, I should say. And was it Trent Robinson from Notre Dame? I'm blanking.
Brent Robinson.
I'm sorry, Brent. Yeah, talking about like the way that social media frames our lives. And I don't know about you, Bo, but when I talk to experts on those matters, it can be kind of overwhelming because you can begin to identify some of the crass materialism and consumerism of our culture, but it's hard to know how to, I don't know if like extricate yourself is the right word, but to try to find like different practices. And the church during the season of Lent just gives us real concrete ways to do that. It just sets before us ways where we have to put in our pound of flesh, so to speak, where we're called to give alms, and that there's a certain level of like that hits me right in the wallet, and so there's a sacrifice there. I hope this connects. I was reading an old devotional manual on purgatory, mm-hmm. and purgatory, of course, is like this passive penance or purgation that we'll do after life is over if we are not prepared for the beatific vision. And the writer was saying that one of the pains of purgatory, so to speak, is like there you see God and you see what you're destined for, and then it's taken away from you. And the pain is like you're being purged and prepared for union with God. But in that place, you have nothing else to distract you. And it's really struck me. In life, I don't know about you, Bo, but for me sometimes, like when I feel that kind of like existential loneliness or longing that just comes with being human in a sinful world, my immediate temptation or my immediate habit is to turn to my phone or to turn to like a snack or something. And sometimes I don't even need that information. I don't even need that food, but it just kind of puts a Band-Aid over that sort of like longing or pain that I feel. And so I guess what I'm saying is like as a form of purgation, as a form of penance, I think during Lent we're called just to set aside, especially and be intentional about those ways where when we should focus our attention on God, we instead turn to these lesser goods just as a form of distraction.
No, I think that's good. I was going to make a joke about, sorry, I was reading my phone while eating something, but it's Ash Wednesday, and I don't want people to think that I'm sitting here chomping, on anything before we're on the radio.
Yeah.
No, but this is a great point, and one of the proofs that we can focus on a lesser good instead of the greater one is when we decide which penances we're going to do. We can actually get obsessed with the idea of choosing the penance and how this shows our spiritual prowess, rather than, like you said, get at the heart of the matter of what penances are about. People have pointed out that, in certain years past, they tried to give up coffee, and I think the meme says, and I ended up 100% the very opposite of Jesus without coffee. Yeah. And they make a point that, like, whatever you're supposed to do penitentially is to become more like Christ, not to show that you're some sort of spiritual, gladiator that can scale the walls of different penances. And first of all, it's a great point. Don't try to be exciting with your penances. The idea is, like you said, how do we eliminate distractions? How do we give up just enough so that we can focus on the Lord, not so that we get focused on the giving up? But I also think this points out exactly something else you were getting at, that if we don't have the community and indeed the public space that recognizes the necessity of penance, it's always going to be a great temptation to think that I am doing this penance myself, and what I'm doing is through my great struggle and exertion, I am making myself more holy. But it's like you said, the sort of fact of sinful world, sinful life, living with difficulty and pain and evil, I start to have to look at the reality of who I am in light of the world and eternity and God. That is painful. It's the sort of purgation here on earth. Looking to God and realizing our great need for Him and how we failed in the past should be penitential and painful enough. But exactly like you said, we try to fill that, dealing with that angst, that difficulty, with entertainments, with small things, with distractions. And so Lent calls us back communally to try to do away with those distractions. And oftentimes we do this by even taking away things that are good. So Lent is not a time where you're only getting rid of the things that you don't ultimately need. Although, sure, like the fact that we won't need to be entertained in heaven because we'll be before God is a good enough reason to use your phone less during Lent. That's very true.
Yeah.
But the Gloria, which presumably will be one of the hit tunes in heaven that we'll sing quite a bit because it's exactly celebrating the glory of God, we decide not to sing during Lent to remind us that on this life we're not quite there yet. The same thing with our favorite holy, the word that we buried yesterday and don't sing in hymns until we get to Easter. That, of course, that word is going to be said everlastingly in heaven, but we place it to the side to remind us to not be distracted, not with heaven, but with acting like we're already there when we're not. And so, again, that's one thing to understand as an individual, but if we could figure out how to do that as a community, and indeed when whole social orders could do that it just spoke a different truth than I think most of us are used to.
Bo, I'm going to betray my ignorance here, but when you're talking about not singing the Gloria and things, we were on a text thread recently where one of our friends said, we buried the Alleluia yesterday. There's not a tradition of families like burying a written Alleluia in their backyard or anything. That's like we suppress the Alleluia, right?
Well, I think that I do think that you'll see that there's people who will do practices like that to, of course, manifest it, that it's waiting or and I'm guessing that I'm not going to speak authoritatively enough. It sounds like something they do in New Orleans because that's one more reason to have a parade, So I literally think that there might be Latin countries that celebrate some version of Carnival that they will bury the Alleluia figuratively, and then it's of course resurrected with Christ on Easter. But I don't think there's some sort of formal liturgy, right? That's just the idea that we don't sing the Alleluia through Lent.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know. Like, if someone's trying to sell their home, they'll sometimes bury a St. Joseph statue.
Right.
So I don't know if certain Catholic families like crafted a wooden Alleluia and then buried that object. But I think it's probably just a.
There's a billion of us, so if someone fashioned or like made a doll, named it Alleluia, completely possible. What I think I've seen is that they sort of have like a small casket and they put like a black shawl over it, and so they're burying it until then it's resurrected at Easter. But this is a good reason if you know, like, use the zip whip line 515-223-1150 to tell us if we know, and especially if you're listening and you're actually from a place that does this celebration, you might be hearing this later. Please let us know. We'll do #UCG for the Uncommon Good. We'll check it out and tell people. But of course, the idea is, wouldn't it be awesome to have a culture that publicly one of the first things you did after Fat Tuesday was over on Wednesday is you had a procession where you did something like that to remind someone, everyone, that we are still in via, we're still on the journey. We have purgation to do here and now, but not simply as individuals, but as a community. As communities, we have penance to do. And, but we're getting ready to come up on the break, but just to think of that reality, how on earth would you even imagine doing a communal penance we do communal penances where everybody gets together and they all individually confess, but what would it be like for a town to do penance? What it would be like for a region or even a country? And I think the idea of that outstripping our imagination says a lot about the societies we live in. And we're coming up on the break, so I think when we get back, that can be where we start off. How is it that we no longer belong to groups interconnected enough that we could imagine what it would look like for the entire group to do penance? Would the head of that group do it? Was there something we would all do? Something that used to happen, I would think, very easily in the ancient medieval world, but very recently would become too difficult for us to imagine. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, broadcasting from KWKY Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. We'll be back right after this. Back to The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr coming to you broadcasting from KWKY Iowa Catholic Radio Studios here on this Ash Wednesday. It's good to have all of you listening to us. Bud, we are talking today about penance and the public order. We left off the last segment talking about, is it possible for communities themselves or an entire public to do penance? And so I think we're going to dive off on that direction. What comes to mind when you hear this idea, can entire groups do penance together?
Well, when you were talking about that, my mind went back to that meme that you shared where someone had written, last year I gave up coffee for Lent and became 100% less like Jesus. And I don't know how you feel, Bo, but I think Lent and Ash Wednesday especially is one of the most fruitful times in the church for great memes. Like if you've ever seen the diagram that runs down like the different ashes in position, like the style that your priest gives you.
Right.
That one's pretty great. I had a friend who wrote like, single ladies, if you're looking for a great Catholic guy, they'll all be marked tomorrow. And like you'll be able to identify who's a mass goer or whatnot.
Right.
And I think that does start to, that last one does get at what you're talking about. So it's always interesting to me on Ash Wednesday, even turning on cable news and things, you'll see persons and you'll think like, oh, he's Catholic. And sometimes it gives me pause because you're like, I don't know if that's a great witness for the church, but
right.
I'm usually challenged when I have that thought. And it's sort of like, the short story Revelation by Flannery O'Connor.
Yes.
I think the main character's name is Ruby Turpin, and she eats her vegetables and says her prayers and pays her taxes, goes to church every Sunday, but is prone to judgmentalism. And I don't want to like hash out the whole story. But at the end of the story, through this series of events, she ends up having this vision of like a procession to heaven, all these individuals going to heaven. And I wish I had it in front of me, but just sort of like, it's the wheat and the tares. It's a mishmash of people. And there seems to be even like a surprise at like who's leading the procession. And I guess I feel like communally on Ash Wednesday, there's this kind of leveling, and viscerally, like physically, you see all those who are part of the body of Christ by virtue of their baptism, and you see this with the ashes on their foreheads. And like I said, for me, it can be a mixed experience, and I have various like thoughts and feelings about it all. But I'm reminded, like, oh, the rich and the poor, that person on cable news, and my next door neighbor, they're all part of this body that's journeying to heaven. And it starts like my call is not to decide like who's in and who's out, but to enter more deeply into the sorrow that I should have for my own sins.
Yeah, I think that a wonderful way to understand this, you'll hear this from Protestant apologetics against Catholicism, and I'm not being rude here, just I've heard this before. They'll point to the scriptures where Jesus says, don't make a big deal out of your penance, right? Wash your face, put oil on,
Sure.
Do this all in secret. So they ask, why do you actually put ashes on your head? And you have to point out that actually the ashes on your head is not the sign of penance. It's not like we put ashes on our head every day through the 40 days. The ashes on your head is to point out that everyone's going to die, and it doesn't matter how much money or prestige or fame that you have. And especially if you think of Christian orders, again, this goes back to the public nature of penance, where nearly everyone was Catholic, or at least a huge majority was, for everyone to have ashes put on their head, prince and pauper alike, is, as you're pointing out, a great leveling. So to go around and see that a magistrate and even the sort of, village homeless all had the same ashes on their head was to remind everyone, memento mori, that they too would die, and that they think they could get out of it alive, but certainly they will not. And so the penance of Ash Wednesday, putting ashes on your head, is not to say, hey, look, everyone at me, I'm fasting. It's to say, you too will die. It's the memento mori and the leveling effect that is now had because as a community, we did all of that. And it's like you said, Bud, when you have it done that way, that starts to make you go, okay, well, I would assume that, only the holiest of holy people eventually go, get these ashes. And that meme is a joke, of course, but if we took it seriously that, oh, now you know who the good Catholics are because they have ashes on their head, you'd actually be sorely mistaken, because funny enough, even though Ash Wednesday is not a holy day of obligation, it's probably one of the most attended celebrations in all of Catholicism. It really does seem that if there's one thing people really have a hankering for, is that things or stuff occur in a liturgy. And I'm telling you, Ash Wednesday, it is always something that people will come out of the woodwork and do. Now, I just think, psychologically, it's because people are like, yeah, you get ashes and it's once a year. But I think God is using it precisely as you're saying. It's actually not the good Catholics, because there's not this special category called good Catholics. We're all sinners and we'll all die, and that'll be the end of the story, except for what Jesus has done on the cross, which should be what we're focusing on in Lent. And so I think that's a beautiful way to do that. For me, Bud, the most powerful is when, they put the ashes on like babies and children and say, from ash you have come and to ash you will return. That it's important for us to remember these children that we love so much and that we put so much effort onto. The same fate happens to them, and it's a sort of hardcore moment. It kind of takes your breath away a little bit, but it makes us ponder what we're supposed to ponder. And I actually think the sort of move against Catholics doing that sort of misses the point. But to grant them part of their argument, I think we miss the point about the ashes sometimes.
Yeah, I really like your point about how it brings folks out of the woodwork, and just I'm always struck each year at the number of people who show up for Mass. And it's kind of funny to me, because I've been a part of conversations about how do we bring people into the church, or how do we keep the young interested in church. And a lot of times, and I've been prone to this too, Bo, but you just have this temptation to say like, well, let's kind of dampen down like the negative, the harsh stuff, the severe stuff, and we'll make it fun, especially for the teens. Like we got to have, let's have pizza and cool music, and not really like ask too much for them. And then you go on and you just celebrate like a liturgy that the church has been doing for centuries. And the central part of the liturgy is a rite where you remind people that they were from dust and will return to dust, and everyone shows up. And And I just think it can be a good reminder to us that like people actually they need this. And I had a good friend this year who lost her husband to cancer at a very young age, and is just in a really difficult spot with young children and things like that. And one thing that she's been forthright with on social media is just having the space to grieve. And I think like I know many of our the ecclesial communities like Protestantism, they've dropped some of these traditions that Catholics hold tight to, and I feel like these liturgies, like I don't want to make them functional like they have a certain purpose, but when we set aside a time of year where we enter into the fasting and the prayer that our Lord did as a lead up to the memorialization of his passion, I think it creates a kind of space for people to grieve and for people to weep without having to turn the limelight on them. Like we don't schedule an event where we say like everyone who's been through a divorce or who has lost a loved one or is struggling with illness, like come this evening. But it's just like the liturgies by their natural rhythm make this sort of thing available.
You're listening to The Uncommon Good, broadcasted from KWKY, Iowa Catholic Radio Studios. But I think it's a good point. It would be, frankly, terrible to be like, all right, everyone who's sad today, get in here in the middle of the narthex, and we're going to all look at you. And even if you were trying to pray for them, you're here like, oh, goodness, please don't do that. Yeah. But the idea that for Lent, and then, we could do a better job of this throughout the year, that we have time and space for that. I think you're exactly right. I think the other thing, too, shows that if we start to think of this communal nature, like we're pointing out, rather than Lent just being this individual, spiritual exercise that I'm trying to get spiritually buff or whatever we mean, it can start to alleviate of a misconception and something I think people maybe go astray sometimes in Lent. When you try to choose the most awesome penance ever, the best Lent ever, I think people have been saying, making a sort of joke about the mismatch of the self-help, well-being, wellness impetus that's sort of getting into Lent, that you can there's always, it seems to be sort of a pop thing that's sort of Lenten that people try to appropriate, like Maria Konda's like, get rid of your stuff and minimalize it. Does this bring joy / Lent minimal, okay. Keto is somehow being turned into Lento, it's kind of crazy. But I don't want to like bash people completely. They're trying to do something. Lent is about trying to become a better you, but of course a better you who has turned to Christ and realized, that you too will die and that you can't do this without him. So there's some overlap, but then there's some completely different absolute reasons why we're doing this. You're not trying to improve yourself in Lent. You're trying to surrender yourself to Christ, who is you in your complete fullness. What I'm getting at is there's a way in which if you start to do the communal understanding of what's going on with Lent, you kind of stop worrying about tailor-making your penance. On one hand, when you share penance, even if it's not that difficult for you, you're talking about the Marr household, you guys mostly for health reasons have to do largely a vegetarian meal, so you don't give up tons when Lent comes around. But to be a part of a community that's doing that already starts to give a broader, fuller, embodied understanding of what we do when we do penance together. But then you think about the fact that life is going to throw plenty of penances towards you your entire life. We know people who've had spouses have died, who've lost children, who've lost people to suicides, who lost people to overdoses. There's plenty of you listening now that have the penance that God has chosen for you, that you aren't somehow an insufficient Catholic because you're not up to, going through the spiritual Olympics in addition to what you're dealing with. No, in fact, that difficulty that you are dealing with, that true cross, Lent is a time, as Bud has said, for you to honestly have time to weep and grieve about it, because precisely the brokenness and the death-entangled nature of the world is part of what Lent is supposed to be about, that we're honest about it and that we grieve it. Folks, Lent is supposed to remind us that we do not have ultimate control about making ourselves better, that truly we all too one day will be submitted to a cross that will eventually finish us off, and that we have to learn to surrender ourselves to God's providence, because even in all of those difficulties and evils and crosses, there is resurrection down the way. It's not for nothing that the world currently is in anxious fear about something like this COVID-19 and the coronavirus that's come out of China. And yesterday was a huge day in the news. I mean, for some of us dorks who follow the news way too much, we've been worrying about this for a while, but it really was a huge shift in the news yesterday when you had things like the CDC and like these world organizations telling people like, you need to be prepared that this new virus might disrupt your normal life. Now, that can mean all sorts of things, like we don't get to have, public events that it's very scary because it's an open-ended thing. You kind of wish they would explain that more. But the point is, even this, with that on the horizon, Lent is the perfect time to think about this, not because there's anything to get all self-improvey about it. It's good for us in 2020 because we could probably live our lives until something bad happens, imagining that we're not dependent on the good grace and providence of God. But we are. At our horizon now, as people in the United States, is this scary thing. I think people are, just if you're asking Bo, in some ways overhyping it and in some ways trying to add to the pandemic, but certainly there are people who are underselling how difficult it might be and what it all might mean. That's the sort of burden of living in 2020, where you have tons of information at your hand, but not a lot of good gatekeepers to help you make sense of it. But with all that said, Lent serves that function to say none of us get out of life alive, and none of us live except by being dependent on Christ. All other distractions make us miss that point. And the more that we do this, not as individuals, but as a community, the more that it doesn't seem like this sort of absolute, scary, terrifying, existential threat that I myself alone have to stare into the abyss and break down weeping about. But penance done communally, just like is happening in Lent, is the way that we, so to speak, hold hands and walk through this reality together, coming to grips with the reality of our fallen life, but in the hope of what we see that's coming in the horizon. Easter at the end of Lent, eternal life at the end of this life for all of us. And the communal nature of Lent is the way that we can wrestle with such things without them becoming and invoking despair.
Yeah, Bo, I'm really struck by what you said about life bringing penances our way. And one of the amazing messages embedded in the Christian gospel is that our suffering isn't meaningless, but that we can somehow unite our suffering with our Lord's passion on the cross. And St. Paul said he fills out in his own body those afflictions that were lacking in Christ. So this is an amazing thing that God calls us to be co-workers in this precise manner. And I've always wondered how I would be able to think about suffering and death without, what Revelation says about that sort of thing. But I think one tough part of life is that's an amazing message. But if we don't willingly accept penances now, like if we don't adopt them during times of relative calm in our lives, when those providential penances or afflictions come, I think we'll be unprepared to unite them with Christ like we will want to. And I know whenever I've had a semi-serious illness, even like influenza, it can be really tough to focus on prayer with like the pains of the body that accompany that. And so I think Lent can be a really important time for us to begin to have this kind of like spiritual training. And you and I can't speak too much to like what it's like to run in marathons.
Right.
But if we were to take that on, no one would sign up for one of these marathons, like I don't know how many Ks they are these days, and then just say like, okay, March 17th, I'm going to go run 7 miles, right? That's a recipe to have yourself found on the side of the road. You have to have a whole series of training that leads up to it. And we know that when it comes to like physical training, but so often in our spiritual lives, we think to ourselves like, oh, when the time comes, I'll be ready. Like I love Jesus, when really we haven't done any training beforehand to prepare us for that.
But I actually think it's 26.3 miles. So, if you're thinking 7's bad, definitely don't run a marathon, buddy. No,
I wanted a number that was feasible for me that like people are like, I'm turning this show off. That's insane. But Bud's not running 26.
That's right. I would say, no, I think that's a perfect way. There is a training element. There's obviously throughout the Bible multiple metaphors that make something like Lent and penance described in athletic competition metaphors. But I really think you hit...
I buffet my body and make it my slave, and like so that I don't box the air.
Yes,
all that language in Paul.
Yeah, like I have run the good race, I've earned the crown, which is like the medal that people would get running these races in the ancient world. So, but it's like you said, you I think we've weirdly turned athletic competition into something that's like self-help and improvement, look better, feel better. But St. Paul in many ways is more competitive, and he's like, no, you do these things to win. And that's what we're after, is to win a crown. We're not doing this to improve yourself. And actually, if you wear yourself out falling over the finish line, St. Paul says, good job, because you're doing it for the crown, to win. You're doing it to win heaven, not to look, fly, or whatever the kids are saying. I'm really aging myself. While doing all this. So it's actually not for the gains. That's actually something I know kids say on Twitter. It's not for the gains. It's for the end and the trophy. And that starts to be something that I think is really important. You should do Lent Bud, you put that great, that we are going to face things much tougher than any penance we can give ourselves. Death included, all of us must face. But if we're not prepared in a sort of training way to play the game, to run the race when it's time, we are going to get caught off guard. So that's the sort of razor's edge that I think can make the difference between a great Lent and a not great Lent. If you're doing it just for like the self-improvement culture that's so pervasive in America in 2020, or if you're doing it so that you'll be prepared to win the race when that cross comes in, when that race occurs, which is largely out of our control. And that one last time, because we're running out of time here at the very end, to say, our argument is that a public order that does penance provides that for people much better than if we're just trying to do this all alone. So as much as possible, can we say, have a great and holy Lent. May it be profitable for all that you do, but may we, all of us, have a great and holy Lent. Lord knows there is much penance that we as a church in the United States, but in the entire world, can do for our own sake, for the sake of the world, and for the sake of saying thank you to our Lord Jesus Christ and all that he did. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, our city, our state, the world, the galaxy, the entire kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.